So Phil, thank you for joining us. We were just saying, Phil, it's my first one. Phil is very experienced in this area. Once again, I'm not saying last name, so I can't tell you who that is for confidentiality reasons. But thank you, Phil, for joining me. I appreciate it. Look forward to your feedback afterwards, that's for sure, to hear about this. We're going to get going because we have hit the 8 o'clock hour here, and we want to honor everybody's schedule. Thank you, Phil, for the little like button. I appreciate that. So here's what we're discussing. We are discussing the case of the case in Stanford. And when I say in Stanford, I should say it's a Stanford swimmer who was prosecuted and was sentenced to 6 months. And when the sentencing first occurred, there was outrage to the sentencing of 6 months. And their immediate outrage was only aimed at the judge. And obviously, there is a lot of issue there that we need to discuss about why a judge would make that choice. And by the way, if you're not aware, there are petitions out there to actually recall the judge from the seat. So that has taken place in the last 48 hours. This has moved very quickly. From what I understand, there are thousands of signatures to that. I believe change.org, which is a major petition site for social issues and lots of different issues, they have a petition on there. If you did want to sign it, you can look that up. I'll post that here afterwards. At the end, I'll put it in the comments so that everybody can get to that if you did want to do that. But I also want to talk about something that a lot of people are not talking about, and that is that the judge received 2 recommendations. One recommendation is from the prosecution team. They wanted 6 years for this case. Now, a lot of you could say 6 years is way too low of, well, unfortunately, the way that it works is they say first-time offender, and they are less likely to give severe punishments to first-time offenders. Even in heinous cases, that can be the case if it's a first-time offender. That is not unheard of. Other experts have made those comments in the last few days. So one is from prosecution saying, hey, Julia, thank you for joining us. One is from prosecution saying, hey, we want 6 years. But there's another recommendation the judge looks at. That's from the probations department. Now, that recommendation was for 6 months. Now, here's what's interesting. The defense and what, in other words, what the actual person who was convicted of, his team asked for was 4 months. So you had 3 numbers. You had 4 months being requested by the person who was already convicted. You had 6 months from probations department. That's a major concern right there. 6 months probations department. You had 6 years prosecution. Now, why is this important? By the way, Julia, thank you for sharing that, because right before you came on, I discussed the fact that, Julia, before you came on, I promised confidentiality. And so I won't say your last name or anything specific unless that's okay with you. So I'm going to watch your comment there. If you say, Mike, it's okay for me to share what you just said, then I will. Otherwise, I will not. If people ask questions, then I will absolutely respond to that. But I just want to make sure anybody shares something personal, I won't reveal or say that unless you comment back and saying, that's you, Mike, you can share that. Now, it could be, Julia just said I'm very public, so no worries. And I know you speak out publicly, so I thought so, but I just want to honor that. Maybe everybody can help me. Can you see everybody else's comments? I don't know if you can, so that's good for me to know. So if somebody could just say, Mike, we can see everybody's comments, that knocks out me needing to worry about whether you have last names being seen or that. So just feel free to let me know that, anybody who's listening. I believe, yes. Okay. Well, that makes it easier. So that means thank you everybody for answering. That's great. That as far as it lets me know. So Julia, I want to let everybody know because this is a great example of a strong survivor. Julia's on with us right now. And I know you can see last names and first names. Julia is, in my world, when we talk about survivors and their strength and their courage, is a role model for so many survivors out there. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge Julia because it pertains to what we're going to discuss in this case. If you saw recently the Oscars and the survivors that were on stage with Lady Gaga, Julia was one of those survivors. She speaks out. She speaks out on behalf of survivors, on the courage and strength that is in every survivor that we talk about in our work also. But I want to acknowledge that. So when Julia says, hey, Mike, in my case, I only got 6, the person, not Julia, the convicted assailant only got 6 months, it proves what I was saying earlier, that it's not uncommon for first-time offenders to not get the sentencing most of us would expect. So let's go back to what we were looking at. We had 4 months from the team that actually was defending the convicted rapist in this case. We had 6 months that was coming from probation's department. We had 6 years from the prosecution team. Now, common sense tells you, of course, the person being convicted is going to come in with the lowest number. So wouldn't common sense say at least you would average the lowest, the average of the two scores, which would be the most neutral in theory, neutral being that they have not just been convicted of this crime. So that would be probation's 6 months request, prosecution 6 years request. Now, if you divide that in two, 6 months to 6 years, you're roughly just short of a 3-year sentence. So still 6 months doesn't make sense. That means the judge chose to take the most lenient option possible, which means that the prosecution was ignored, if you really look at this, even though they did everything to prove that this was a conviction. Right? And that's uncalled for. And when we discuss this case, we do need to look at probations, and we need to discuss why they only recommended 6 months. Now, the judge's argument was that more than 6 months, and my guess is that I haven't seen the full probations department recommendations, but my guess is that that wording that the judge used was probably some way, somehow connected to the probation department recommendation. Because the wording the judge used was somewhere along the lines that if this person who was convicted spent more than 6 months in prison, it would do irreparable harm to this person becoming a productive person in our society. And so therefore, 6 months is a sentence, because anything more than that would do more harm than it would do good. Clearly, when you make those statements, you're focused on the assailant, not the survivor. Now, the irony of that is, that means that you somehow believe, as a judge, and the probations department, by the way, who works with the prison system, in theory, believe that the prisons are so messed up that if a human being goes into prison and is in there for more than 6 months, there is no life that person can really have after being in prison for 6 months. And because prisons are so messed up, this is what the judge had to be thinking for this to make any sense. The prisons are so messed up, we're not going to let somebody go to prison for more than 6 months because we don't want to mess up the criminal. Now, if you think about that, that means that nobody should go to prison for more than 6 months. That means, regardless of crime, that would mean homicide, that would mean murder, because in theory, after 6 months, they can't come out and be productive. That makes no sense. None whatsoever. It actually completely lacks logic. Now, I have to say that somebody on here said that by my system, I think, Gary, you can all see the comment, Gary said that by that, the prosecutor should always recommend 100 years, and that would balance out somebody recommending 6 months, and they would always get 50 years. Actually, that's not possible, because the prosecution can only recommend up to what the crime allows to be a conviction rate of. And by the way, you'll notice in this case, the prosecution team did not go excessive. They went 6 years, thinking first-time offender, let's hope that 6 years. We know we're not going to get 20 years, which is more likely what you would get in a rape case if you were going to get the full extension of a sentencing, of the possibilities. You get 20 years. They were only asking for 6 years. So just to be fair there on that comment, no, prosecution teams, when the justice system works right, does not do that. They don't overplay their hand because they believe in the justice system. The sad part is prosecution team here actually did appear to say, we believe the justice system will do the right thing. 6 years, let's get 6 years. They tried to be reasonable in understanding how it typically works first-time offender. It was the judge and probation that chose to ignore the 6 years and go with the lowest numbers. Doesn't add up. By the way, there was no miscommunication, which is what people try to argue in these type of situations. This is not this is an abuse of power. And if you haven't had a chance to look at this case, and I want to be careful here, and I want to be extremely careful, because whenever you talk about case, people try to compare to other cases, which is a complete insult to survivors. And no two cases are the same, and we shouldn't think that one case is drastically worse than another, because the harm done we can't measure. We're not the person who went through it. And even two survivors will tell you they can't tell you exactly what the other survivor's experience was because theirs was different. Jennifer, thank you for adding that, by the way. As many of you can see, she works in the legal system, and she knows that when this is true, that the judge often does go with the probation department recommendations, which is why it's really important that probations make the right recommendation. It's why the video I made earlier today was focused on probations, because I believe what you're saying, Jennifer, is true, that the judge does typically go that way. And so for that reason, we need a smarter system here. We need it so this can't happen. If probations are going to recommend, there needs to be way more than the harm done to the person who's convicted. We need to think about what justice means. What is the definition of the justice system? What does justice look like for the survivor? That's where our country needs to have this discussion. Not just, well, what conviction was right or wrong in each individual case. Let's look at the big picture. What does it mean for a survivor to receive justice? And that's an interesting question. And as we saw Julia say earlier, the person who sexually assaulted Julia got 6 months. Julia will be the first to tell you justice was not served. I don't want to speak for you, Julia, but based on past comments and discussions. And by the way, I believe Julia said earlier only got 3 days. And by the way, Phil, thank you for that. So if you can't see comments anywhere, everyone, Phil just let Sherry know that if you make it full screen and look below the video, when you click on the video, then you see the comments so that you can make comments and ask questions. That is greatly appreciated. And so that's important. Now, Gary, I know there's many other crimes that involve less years than 6 years. But the fact is this crime involves 20 years. If they wanted to, and they want to put the full fact of the law in California on this case, they could have gone after 20 years. And that's why we're focused on this case and staying focused on that, because we need to talk about what we can do to try and make a difference going forward. And I think what we need to do is we need to have a national conversation on what is justice. What about the survivors in these crimes? What are we doing to make sure that they are getting the closure they deserve, the justice they deserve, along the process of the conversation? What are your thoughts out there? Everybody who's watching right now, we have a great group. We've had just a ton join recently. Paul, Claire. And so what do you think is a way that we can get this conversation going so that survivors are getting more justice? And I'm the first to admit that, yeah, could I just interruption. I've never had done this, so I'll have to know next time to take off the Wi-Fi there. And so, I'm sorry, on Julia's case, it was 180 days, 3 days. So thank you for sharing that with us. And you're right, Julia, very few ever see a conviction in the first place. So in California, 6 years, he would have served 75 to 80%. Paul, that's really helpful to know. That's good to know. So in other words, he would have gotten the 3 years if he had been prosecuted for the 6 years. It's important to think about that that's actually taking place. That if the judge had said 6 years, he probably would have served somewhere closer to 3. Now, I don't know if that's going to apply to the 6 months. From what I understood, I think there are some actual parameters to that 6 months. But we need to think about the survivors. And we have survivors that have openly discussed that they are survivors right here in their comments. That's what the case should matter. When we look at a criminal case, the first person we should care about is the person who survived the crime that was done upon them. And what our country tends to do is, when it comes to rape, we have seen this time and time again, people will make comments like, let's not ruin his life, referring to the perpetrator, the assailant. Probably one of the most famous cases we saw this occur on was the Ohio Steubenville case. Steubenville High School, CNN reporter is right outside the courtroom when they convict and says these poor guys' lives have just been ruined.